Shalom Aleichem, a guten Tag. Ich heiße Vivian Felsen und es ist mein großes Vergnügen, euch zu begrüßen im Namen von der Komitee für Jiddisch bei der Toronto Jiddische Föderation. My name is Vivian Felsen, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you today on behalf of the UJA Committee for Yiddish. You've probably noticed that you've all been muted, and we're going to keep the microphones off during the entire program. Also, please put your devices on speaker view, and that way you'll be able to see both the speaker and her slides, because this is a slide presentation. The slides are both in Yiddish and English, so you'll be able to follow this presentation in either language. And the other thing we're going to ask you is to please turn off your cameras. We can't do that for you. And it's less distracting if for others, if your videos are turned off. If you have any questions or comments, could you please leave them in the chat box, and the speaker will answer your questions after the presentation. So before I begin, I wanted to mention that our speaker, Vardit Lightstone, is in Jerusalem. And I wanted to acknowledge the terrible tragedy that happened on Friday and the fact that Israel is now in a day of mourning. So unser Mitgefühl von allen. I also, before I want to begin, I would like to thank Sharon Power, an indispensable part of our committee, for all her work, including being behind the scenes today and making sure that everything runs smoothly. And I want to especially thank our co-sponsor, the Ontario Jewish Archives, and in particular, the Managing Director, Donna Bernardo Cerise. She's asked me to read the following on her behalf. Founded in 1973, the Ontario Jewish Archives Blankenstein Family Heritage Centre is the largest repository of Jewish life in Canada. The OJA's collections span all segments of Ontario's Jewish community, including families, businesses, cultural organizations, and synagogues. These records date from the community's earliest days in the province in the 1850s to the present. The OJA supports a wide range of researchers through its vital work. Through exhibitions, programs, research assistance, and walking tours, the OJA tells the stories of Ontario's Jewish community. You can find us online at ontariojewisharchives.org. And since the month of May is Canadian Jewish Heritage Month, we're very pleased to have the Ontario Jewish Archives as our co-sponsor for today's event, which is all about Canadian Jewish heritage. In die Archiven von dem OJA hat unser Gastredner Vardit Lightstone gefunden als Sach von die jüdische Xaviaden, die Manuskripten, wegen welcher sie wird reden. Vardit is a doctoral candidate in a joint University of Toronto and Hebrew University of Jerusalem education program. The working title of her dissertation is Performing Immigrant Identity, Canadian Yiddish Life Stories. In her 2020 article entitled Becoming Canadian, Folk Literary Innovation in the Memoirs of Yiddish-Speaking Immigrants to Canada, that article appeared in the journal Canadian Jewish Studies. This year, her doctoral research is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University. I think that Vardit is unique among graduate students of Jewish studies in that she is interested in Canadian Jewish studies. But not only that, she is also able to conduct her research in Yiddish. Heute wir haben andere junge Graduierstudenten bei unserer kanadischen Universitäten, was vernehmen sich mit jiddischen Limudim. Sehr wenig von sie interessieren sich in kanadische jiddische Limudim. Und meistens von die, was interessieren sich ja in kanadische jiddische Limudim, kennen sie nicht kein Jiddisch. Und doch, vor dem Zweiten Weltkrieg hat der größte Teil von den Jiden in Kanada genutzt Jiddisch in sehr tagtäglichen Lebens. Aber Vardit hat sich ja interessiert in kanadisch-jiddische Geschichte und sie hat sich ja ausgelernt Jiddisch und sie vernimmt sich mit einem sehr wichtigen Kapitel von unserer Geschichte, die Immigration von Mitteleuropa. Heute wird sie uns erzählen wegen die autobiografischen Materialien von Yiddish-reden Jiden, wo sie hat gefunden in jiddischen Archiven in Kanada und befragt in Ontario Jewish Archives. Und jetzt ist es mein großes Vergnügen vorzustellen, Vardit Lightstone.
Schönen Dank, Julian. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. And so without further ado, I'll begin. Between the 1880s and the 1930s, there was a major immigration of Eastern European Jews to Canada. This wave of migration increased Canada's Jewish population by over 700% and established a substantial Eastern European Jewish demographic where they barely had a presence beforehand. The migrants had to adjust to unfamiliar, unexpected, and often unwelcoming social, economic, and environmental situations upon their arrival. Their creative means of adaptation can be seen in the many social and political activities and associations they participated in, and also in the culture they created and the stories they told. Their stories will be the subject of my talk today. A number of these immigrants wrote down their life stories in Yiddish. Some wrote their stories in order to submit them to a competition that UVO New York opened in 1942, which asked American immigrants to write about "Voor was ich bin weg von der alter Heim und was hab ich der Gerecht in Amerika? Why did I leave the old home and what did I accomplish in America?" Of the 223 entries from people all over the Americas, 14 were written by Canadians. Other Yiddish-speaking migrants wrote their life stories down because they were writers as a sideline and composed interesting snippets for publication in Yiddish newspapers and magazines. And some wrote about their lives as a record for themselves and their descendants. Maybe a family member had asked them a question. Maybe they thought their life experiences were unique and noteworthy, or representative of the era of the Great Migration from Eastern Europe. Or maybe they were writing an ethical will, an example for their children and grandchildren, like Google of Hamlin. Maybe they were bored. Sometimes all of the above, including the UVO competition, inspired these writings. In my research, which involved searching Jewish archives across Canada, including the Ontario Jewish Archive, or the UJA, I found 26 life stories written in Yiddish by Eastern European Jewish immigrants to Canada who arrived by 1930. By writing in Yiddish, the authors were making choices. Part of that choice was to use a language with a self-selecting audience, namely other Eastern European Jews. This meant that they did not have to be concerned about displaying and explaining their culture in a positive light to the Canadian majority or to the established Western European Jewish communities. The authors were also choosing to stay connected to Yiddishkeit through the language and through their storytelling. Reading these life stories provides us with insight into the lives of these people, their individual experiences, and also the ways Eastern European Jews adapted to Canada and created a new hybrid culture, Canadian Jewish culture. For this talk, I have chosen readings on 3 themes. First, impressions of Canada, finding work, and funny new arrival stories. Together, these stories provide a sense of experiences of immigration, the resiliency of the authors, and the role of storytelling in cultural continuity and adaptation. The readings are from 7 authors, 5 of which were published and 2 of which are from the UJA. The published authors are Michael Usiskin, who wrote Oxenun Matoran, translated under the title Uncle Mike's Eden Bridge, Joseph J. Goodman, who wrote Gesammelte Schriften, translated as Collected Writings, Esther Shechter, who wrote Die Geschichte von mein Leben, which is untranslated, Hirsch Wolofsky, who wrote Mein Lebensreise, which is translated as A Journey of My Life, and Felix Zoff, who wrote A Fremde Erde, partially translated as On Foreign Soil. The unpublished authors are Joseph Martin and Julius Katz. Both Shechter and Zoff wrote their life stories for YIVO before deciding to publish them, and Zoff, Usiskin, Goodman, and Wolofsky all wrote for Yiddish newspapers as well. Indeed, Wolofsky co-founded and was managing editor of the Montreal Yiddish newspaper Der Canada Adler. All of these authors were born in the former Russian Empire. For the first theme, First Impressions, I've selected excerpts from these life stories in which the authors describe the immigration process at the port, either in Halifax or Quebec City, all of them having arrived by boat, and their impressions of the country after arrival. The first excerpt is by Michael Usiskin. Usiskin was born in Loshvida. He moved from there to London, but quickly became sick of city life. He and a few fellow-minded Jews, including his brother, decided to join the farming community of Edenbridge, Saskatchewan. After reading about it in a newspaper, he arrived in Canada in 1911, a few months after his brother. Let's get to the reading. Oh, there's the slide. Die Prozedur von die Immigrantenbeamte in Quebec ist für uns, für seinen Gefahren so weit wie Zoffenmarv Kanada auf Land, gewinnt von die geringste. Sie haben schon mindestens gewusst, als Homesteaders wollen kein Honig nicht lecken, und man mag uns verdienen die Reise ohne Schwierigkeiten. Usiskin's reception was smooth and uninteresting, at least to him. Although he attributes his easy reception to sympathy on behalf of border control, it was likely influenced by the fact that the Canadian government at the time was actively looking for Europeans to settle Western Canada as part of what was called the Sifton Plan, and that is exactly what Usiskin was planning on doing. Julius Katz was born in Rakov in 1884 and immigrated to Canada in 1907. He came to join his family that had already settled in Toronto. Like Usiskin, Katz had a relatively easy reception at the port. Zu kommen kein Canada hat man gemusst haben $25. Noch ist zugekommen zu mir ein irdischer Inspektor in einer schönen Uniform. Ich hab nicht gewusst, als ist ein Yid und hat angeheben zu reden mit mir in Yiddish. You can probably hear the difference already in writing between a published work and a personal one. I won't diverge into a discussion of the joys of deciphering handwriting and unique spelling and grammar choices. The point is that in his abrupt, idiosyncratic style, Katz tells us about his luck in meeting with a Yiddish-speaking immigrant inspector, or as they were called, a naturalization commissioner. Dealing with an official who spoke the same language made the process of entry much easier and more comfortable. This, combined with the fact that there were no immediate impediments to Katz's entry, allowed for a smooth reception in Canada. Unfortunately, not all of the authors were so lucky, including Joseph Martin. Martin was born in Kiev province in 1875 and immigrated to Canada around 1900. He had family in Montreal, who he initially joined before setting out to try farming and eventually open businesses in Ontario. He ultimately settled in Timmins, Ontario. His arrival and reception at the port of Quebec was neither easy nor comfortable. Wenn der Schiff ist angekommen in Quebec, seien dort gestanden Doktorium in Betracht aller Immigranten, wo seien angekommen. Mich haben sie abgestellt besonder und reingeführt in ein besonder Zimmer. In a Weiler Room hat man reingebracht noch ein solcher wie ich in demselben Zimmer. Man hat uns alle men zusammengenommen und weggeführt in ein Platz, was ist gewesen als eine Sort Hospital. Man hat uns gesagt, als wir wollen dorten darten sein 2 oder 3 Wochen und dann wollen sie sehen, was zu tun mit uns. Einige lässt man ab und einige schickt man zurück. Also wie auf mein Leben bin ich nicht gewesen in der Fremde und bin ich schon gewesen weg 4 Wochen und ich habe sich gefunden in dem Hospital, nicht wissend, was mit mir wird sein. Zum wird mich durchlassen, zum wird mich zurückschicken. Ist schon bei mir geboren der Gedanke, als ich wollte mich mit Zufriedenheit gefahren zurück heim, weil ich habe angefangen zu fühlen, was es heißt, sein in der Fremde. Ich meine, zu sein in einem fremden Land und ohne Sprache, also wie Stummer. Ich habe sich aber getröstet, als ich willkommen in Montreal, anstatt mit Jeden, und ich will sein mit meinen Cousins, weil ich schon nicht sein so verloren und so fremd. Martin's unedited and repetitive style is especially emotive. It's easy to imagine this man sitting in front of you and telling his story, repeating, almost meditating on the uncertainty of his future, half hoping he would be sent home despite all the effort he made to enter Canada in the first place. The language issue was one which confronted most Eastern European Jewish migrants. Although almost all of them could speak several languages, English and French were rarely on the list. Unless like Usiskin, they had previously spent time in an English-speaking country. Martin evocatively expresses the fear and isolation involved in arriving in a new country alone and being required to quarantine in a government hospital without being able to fully understand what was happening or express himself to anyone. Martin's experiences were at least as common, if not more so, than Katz's and Usiskin's. Joseph J. Goodman provides a different perspective on the entry process than the previous authors. Goodman was born around 1863 in the Pale of Settlement, exact location unknown. He immigrated to the United States sometime between 1882 and 1891, and around 1901, Goodman moved to Winnipeg. He had various jobs, one of which was as a naturalization commissioner for the Canadian government, a position that required him to leave the city at times. The Yiddish-speaking commissioner Katz met apparently was not the only one. The following is an excerpt from his vignette, Fliegen und Menschlich, Flies and Little People, in which he reflects on his work. Ich bin in Portal. Es ist die Haupttür, durch welche Amerikaner kommen herein in Marib, Canada, zu besetzen sich auf die fruchtbaren Felder von Saskatchewan und Alberta, die Eldorado von Weizen und Korn. Ich bin schon da in der Grenzstätte auf Hochzeit. Die Arbeit ist ganz leichte. Ich darf examinieren die Immigranten und ich verstehe die Arbeit. Von welcher Jid kann das nicht stellen Fragen? Die Arbeit wird gewesen ganz angenehm, wenn anstatt examinieren Menschen mit Gefühlen, wollte ich gedacht examinieren Ziegel oder sortieren Bretter. Es ist meine Pflicht zu beschließen, welcher von den vielen Immigranten ist wünschenswert zu haben als ein zukünftiger Kanada-Bürger, und welchen man darf schicken zurück. Ich darf bloß noch folgen gewisse Regeln und ausführen das Gesetz. Und ich begreife vielleicht zum ersten Mal, als Gesetz ist nicht allemal gerecht. Pflicht und Menschengefühl, Dien und Rachmanos, wie möglich ist sie einzuspannen in einem, als sie sollen können harmonisch schleppen den Bogen von gesellschaftlichem Leben. Goodman's story gives some insight into the process of migration from the official side, and he expresses his ambivalence about the system. This process is the one which allowed him to become a Canadian citizen himself, which he is grateful for. But while enacting the immigration laws, he is frustrated by how soulless they are, forcing him to approve people by dry details, like the place of origin, profession, etc. Goodman does not directly address the racial aspect, such as the 1885 law, which made it nearly impossible for Chinese people to immigrate, but that may have been one of the things on his mind. These 4 excerpts give a rounded perspective on experiences and the process of entry to Canada during this period, the role of the naturalization commissioners in approving people, and the treatment of the migrants upon first arrival. But what did the migrants think when they encountered Canada after leaving the ports? Felix Zolf, whose autobiography Afrem der Erd is the longest of these writings, includes lengthy poetic descriptions of the landscape in his life story. Zolf was born in 1902 in Zamoshtia and moved to Canada in 1926. He arrived at the Halifax port and from there took the train to Montreal. His first impressions of Canada were from that train ride. Der Kanadier Himmel hängt auf der Chrümeter, a Triebbeer, Wolkens Jogen laufen, trogen sich einer über den anderen und warfen umet. Die Bahn schneit sich herein und schneit sich heraus durch nackte Berg, durch grüne Tollen und durch schächersjeme breschistige Wälder, wo kein menschlicher Fuß hat noch nicht getrotten. Da und dort, bei Seite vom Weg, liegt ein übergekehrter Baum, was Wind und Sturm haben ausgerissen mit die Wurzeln von der Erde. Da und dort hängt in der Luft zwischen Himmel und Erde ein zweiter, ein dritter Baum, hält sich an bei die Zweigen von seinen Brüderbäumen, was lassen ihm nicht wegfallen zu der Erde. Die Bahn läuft, jogt sich zwischen Schures abgerissene Berg. Der Anblick von die zerworfene, formlose Berg mit sehr rot-gelblichen, bronzenem Collier, warfen an auf mir, dem Ausgewurzelten, eine Bänkschaft zum eigenen Land, zu die eigene weißrussische flache Felder und zu die summerdicke dörfische Vernachten, wenn die peurische Harmonika pflegt sich so herzig zu spielen und ihre süße, unmittige Tenor pflegen abklingen, het weit über die gedichte, grüne, polische Wälder. Zolf's romantic descriptions of vast swaths of untouched nature reflects the image of Canada that the government promoted in order to entice immigrants. They also reflect the desires of many Eastern European Jewish immigrants, including Zolf himself, who were unable to own property in the Russian Empire. They were hoping to become farmers in Canada. Zolf tempers his romantic descriptions with nostalgia. In contrasting the Canadian and Belarusian landscapes, Zolf is less dramatically expressing the same homesickness, the same loneliness which Martin experienced when he was forced into quarantine. Usiskin does not describe his train ride, but he does describe his arrival at the train station closest to the Eden Bridge settlement. Ich hab nicht gekonnt verstehen, für was mein Bruder, was hat sicher gekriegt mein Brief von London, wenn ich will ankommen, ist nicht gekommen zu der Stanzia. Ich weiß, als man schreibt den Brief, muss doch erst einmal ankommen. Ich hab aber nicht gewusst von einer Sort Zivilisation, als ob der Weg ist schlecht, ist der, was führt voneinander die Brief zu jeder Post meilenweit eine von zweiter, legt es ab auf eine zweite Woche. Nicht heint ist Ibrachtag. Usiskin understood he was moving somewhere rural, but his unpleasant surprise and confusion at the way the mail system works reveals that he didn't really get what rural meant. His unfamiliarity with farming life is further revealed by his reaction to the first person he meets. Derweil, ständig azoi unter Bregdechel, habe ich bemerkt, als etwas beschaffen ist, fortzogen als das ist ein Mensch, bewegt sich in einer Gruppe gegenüber mir. Habe ich sich gefreut, ein Mensch in der Welt kennt seine Freund. Von dem Mensch habe ich mehr nicht gesehen wie ein paar lange Füße in verblottigte Overalls, was ist für mir gewesen errettet, was für klar das ist gewesen Näherheit, auf den Kopf ein Papacha über die Ohren. Und ich wollte sagen, als auf die Plätze ist etwas gewesen als ein Beged, was ist schwer zu urteilen, was das ist. Ist das ein Pelz? Ist zu was Ende Mai ein Pelz? Ist das ein Mackinac? Ist für was stecken von dorten ein Reuslocken wie von einem Hund? Und gucken die Gesoi auf dem Nefesh, wie chrappet es so Geschmack, habe ich ihm bald Mekane gewesen. Ich in dem Londoner Hiloch mit denen Keschichlich, in einem summerdicken Mantel, hat mir geträßelt ein Ton und ein Ton von Kält. Weiß ich heraus, als der Mensch ist schon da ein Farmer von 8 Jahren Zeit und wohnt 9 Meilen von der Stanzia, und führt jedens keinen mit Krim zu der Bahn. Fort reist von daheim 6 Säger vor Nacht und fort a ganze Nacht, bis hat die Bahn 4 Säger in der Früh. Und da in Groben ist das sein Hotel, wo abzuruhen. Und der Farmer ist grot gewesen sehr ein Angelehnter. Gekennt kiemat alle russische und amerikanische Klassiker auf Eisenwenig. Und hat mich da verweilt mit der Lektion von politischer Ökonomie. Wenn ich hab ihm erzählt, als ich 4 mit sich von London 200 Bücher und Journalen, habe ich bemerkt, als bei dem Mann fliehen Funken von die Augen. Wollte es auch da liegendig eingeschlungen. Usiskin's first impressions of his new home feel a lot like what City Mouse might have thought when he first visited Country Mouse. But he ends up being pleasantly surprised by the level of culture and education around him. Esther Shechter does not have the same turnaround in her first impressions. Shechter was born in 1867 in Mezhbish and moved to Winnipeg in 1905 from Odessa, joining her husband who had immigrated several months previously. Shechter's first impressions of Winnipeg were not favorable. Es ist mir gewesen sehr schwer auf den Herzen zu verlassen als eine kulturelle Zwiebel, wie ich habe gehabt in Odessa, als eine breite Bekanntschaft von intelligenten Freund. Aber wenn ich bin angekommen in Winnipeg und habe der Sinn, die Hölzerne häslich und die Gassen seien noch a viele kein Sewers nicht gewesen, die Sprache habe ich euch nicht gekannt, ist mir geworden sehr bitter auf den Herzen. Moving from an important European cultural center to Winnipeg, a city that was just beginning to take shape in 1905, was a huge and disappointing culture shock. These few stories of arrival in Canada show the range of experiences that Eastern European Jewish immigrants had on entering the country and the first impressions as a romantic landscape or somewhat of a cultural backwater. Despite their adventurous spirit, these migrants felt some homesickness, some regret they had to process. Part of processing it was telling their stories, remembering and reminding others how they overcame without ignoring the difficulty. Upon arriving, the first thing most of the migrants had to do was find work. Joseph Martin, who as we know was looking forward to reuniting with his cousins in Montreal, was especially eager to find work in order to send money back to his wife and children. Unfortunately, getting work was not so easy, even after joining his cousins. Es seien a Rieber a paar Tag, und keiner von sie hat mich nicht gerufen zu gehen in Gassereis. Hab ich schon verstanden auf den Wunk, was sie meinen. Bis ich bin zugegangen zu meiner Cousine und gefragt bei ihr, was kann das sein von mir? Zu was kann ich sich nehmen zu verdienen etwas, als die Sprache kann ich nicht, und wo zu gehen ergens fragen, weiß ich euch nicht. Meine Cousins seien gewesen Pressers in a Shop und ganz fein verdient. Antwortet mir meine Cousine, darf sich nicht ellensäugig zu suchen Arbeit, und zweitens schämt sich mein Bruder mit dir zu gehen in Gas, weil du truckst a Bord. Mein Vater hat mich einmal geschlagen, weil ich hab sich einmal herumgescheuert die Bord. Wenn du wirst abgehen dein Bord, wird man mit dir können rausgehen in Gas. Wegen Arbeit darfst du sich nicht sorgen, du bist erst nicht lang gekommen. Ruh sich aus ein bisschen vom Weg. Ich hab dir Sinn, als die erste Sache, was ich darf tun, ist abzurasieren sich, und dann will ich sich fühlen in Haus ein bisschen heimischer. Demselben Tage bin ich gewesen ein Amerikaner. Both his language and his appearance hindered Martin from finding a job. Many of the authors in the life stories I've collected describe having to change their appearance upon arrival as part of the process of integration. Martin adds the extra dramatic layer of breaking cultural religious practice, which his father had enforced so strongly back home. Establishing oneself in Canada was not just being accepted by the government. One also had to be accepted by those around them. Shechter's husband also struggled when he first arrived, partly because the organization that helped him immigrate, the Jewish Colonization Association, ICA for short in Yiddish, did not plan properly. Es haben sich demnächst organisiert ein Zoll Junggeleit in Odessa, zuvor in Kanada, zu werden Farmers. Man hat sie versprochen zu geben Homesteads dorthin und sie helfen durch der ICA, was ist gegründet geworden mit der Hilfe von dem Bären Hirschfond. Bald wie die Immigranten seien angekommen in Montreal, hat sie der Komitee verrufen und erklärt, als sie sollen rausgehen suchen Arbeit derweil bis in Frühling. Sie seien angekommen in November und haben gedacht, warten bis in Frühling, bis man wird, können sie besetzen auf Homesteads. Mein Mann, welcher ist von Fach gewesen ein Drucker, hat in Montreal keine Arbeit nicht gekonnt bekommen. In Montreal seien damals noch nicht gewesen keine irdische oder russische Druckereien und kein Englisch hat nicht gekonnt. Derweil hat man genommen Arbeiter in Waldereien, zu arbeiten neue Materialien. Mein Mann hat beschlossen, zuvor in Waldereien arbeiten über den Winter und im Frühling zurückkommen kein Montreal zu nehmen a Homestead. Gesagt hat man sie, als der Wald ist nicht weit von Montreal. Man hat die Arbeiter abgenarrt, denn man hat sie gesagt, als der Wald ist nicht weit von Montreal. Und man hat sie verführt nicht weit von Winnipeg. Ben Brera hat schon mein Mann gemusst reinfahren kein Winnipeg, anstatt zu fahren kein Montreal. Without family or friends to help him navigate Canadian society, and with minimal English, Shechter's husband was easily taken advantage of by employers. Luckily, in Winnipeg, members of the local Jewish community stepped in to help him out, including someone named Mrs. Tepper. Mein Mann hat sich noch gefragt, zuerst durchfahren a jiddische Druckerei. Man hat ihn übergegeben, als kein andere Druckereien außer Englische seien da nicht da. Und als die Industrie Bichlal ist noch da nicht entwickelt. Mrs. Tepper ist mit ihm herumgegangen von Drucker zu Drucker und gebeten, man soll ihm geben Arbeit. Also wie kein Setzer hat nicht gekonnt sein, Machmeister hat nicht gekonnt die Sprache, hat sich gestellt arbeiten als Maschinist. Mrs. Tepper hat ihm gekriegt eine Stelle bei der Pill Printing Co. Hat bald genommen a Lehrer, der domestische Rav Mr. Rubin, zu lernen sich Englisch. Wenn hat gearbeitet 2 Wochen, hat gebeten eine Reise. Die Lage von meinem Mann hat sich also zu bisslich verbessert. Und mein Mann ist dennoch geworden der Vormann in derselben Druckerei, wo hat gearbeitet bis zum letzten Tag von seinem Leben. For Shechter's husband, as for other immigrants, learning English was an essential part of establishing a career in Canada, since Yiddish cultural institutions did not have a strong enough presence to become employers. With his own determination, learning English, communal support, and his skilled background, he was able to achieve a measure of success in his new home. Some few migrants saw the lack of business tailored to Eastern European Jews as an opportunity as opposed to an obstacle. Hirsch Wolofsky was one of these. Born in Shidlovich in 1879, he moved to Montreal in 1900. When Wolofsky was confronted by the same absence of Yiddish newspapers as Shechter's husband, in 1907 he decided to create one, der Canada Adler. Mit etliche Wochen vor der Erscheinung von Canada Adler hat der Hige Drucker angeheuben herausgeben a wöchentliche Zeitung in der Form von einem Zirkular, und doch hat es der Eulam zugehabt. Das hat erst weiter mich überzeugt, wie nötig es ist, eine emisse irdische Zeitung, und ich habe beschlossen zu rufen ein Meeting von der Zolljiden für den Zweck. Der Meeting ist vorgekommen im Haus von verstorbenen Mr. Wilansky. Der Letzter hat gesagt, der Fachmann sehen dich als Collector von jiddischen Tagblatt in New York. Wir haben aber später ausgefunden, als eine Fachmannschaft besteht in Erweiterklappen die Adressen auf die Zeitungen und als es war ein viel besserer Weg, wie so das zu tun. Beim Meeting sehen wir gewähnt 7 Menschen und nach etlichen Meetingen, wenn 2 von uns sind herausgefallen, ist beschlossen geworden, als jeder soll investieren zu $1,000 und als mit die $5,000 von die 5 Verinteressierte in dem Plan soll man zutreten, herauszugeben eine wöchentliche Zeitung. Den Namen hat der Demostiker Hidder Rabbi Glaser bestimmt als Kanada Oder, wie unsere Zeitung heißt bis heute. In den Verlauf von der heutigen Zeit ist schon in 508 St. Lawrence Boulevard gestanden die erste jiddische Linotype-Maschine in Canada. Wolofsky's gamble paid off, and der Canada Adler became the longest-running Canadian Yiddish newspaper. Finding work, having a home, having income were the most important goal for these immigrants. For many, like Shechter's husband and Martin, there was the extra pressure to earn enough to bring wives and children or other family members across to join them. Whether starting a new business or finding an existing job, the immigrants had to overcome language and cultural barriers while also finding the market niche where they would fit. All the authors were eventually able to support themselves and their families, and the stories about their difficulties illustrate their perseverance and adaptability. This brings us to the third theme, funny stories. Through funny stories, as we shall see, the Eastern European Jewish migrants processed the gap between their knowledge based on their life experiences up until then and the situations that they were confronted with in Canada. They do this by choosing to laugh at their confusion around basic aspects of life. Katz tells one such story, which takes place shortly after he left the port. A Frau hat uns gegeben Früchte und euch Bananas. Ich hab das keinmal nicht gesehen. Ist dort gewesen ein Mann von Rakov. Wenn man hat ihm gegeben ein Banana, hat reingebissen mit die Schale. Hat der Materialist gesagt zu ihm, Griner, das schält man an. Hab ich es angestellt und angehoben zu essen. Aber für mir ist es nicht gewesen gut. Etwas weg, kein Tam. Banana singularity is not limited to slipping on the peel, it turns out. In fact, similar stories were relatively common among new European arrivals to North America, and even feature in Mary Anton's famous The Promised Land. Katz and his fellow migrants' confusion on being handed a fruit, an everyday item, represents the multiple small, commonplace things which confuse new arrivals. Usiskin recounts a few humor stories on first arriving in Edenbridge, among which can be counted his story of the first person he meets, which I told before. His plan to walk around the farming community on his own shortly after arrival is another. I will only read the beginning, as it's quite a long adventure. Das ist gewesen bald wie ich bin gekommen in Edensbridge. Wenn ich bin noch mit der Wildnis nicht gewesen bekannt, hat sich mir vergewussen zu gehen nach Post. Etwas ist mir ausgekommen unmittig, zu sitzen so an der Zeitung, und Escher wette Brief sein. Mein Bruder hat mich gerade gewarnt, als ich soll nicht gehen. Eins hat getan, wie kannst du gehen 6 Meilen zu der Post und schon Andeutung von etwas weg? Du kannst doch verkriechen het in Jehovitz, und wir wollen dich davon gehen suchen, wie wir haben es gehabt mit Jack Brody. Was ist verblundet geworden in Bad auf 2 Tage, und Sache Kohl ist gewesen 1 Meile von daheim. Wer hat nicht gekannt, treffen, wo zu gehen. Zweitens, sagt kannst du noch reinfallen in eine Blotte, wo du wirst haben an unsichtste Mikva, und du wirst dich gut zu kühlen, und es wird dich kosten teuer. Und drittens, hat getan, wirst du doch die 6 Meilen durch den Wald für 1 Tag nicht durchkriechen, und so wie du kennst, da noch keinem nicht. Wirst du nicht haben, wo überzunächtigen in Weg. Und Bichlal, wie kann das ein Mensch weglosen sich in Azam Mahalich, in Londoner Schichtlich, was teugen nur für ein Trottoir? Of course, Usiskin doesn't listen to his brother and goes for it. None of his brother's worst predictions come true, but it definitely wasn't an easy trip. At one point, a farm wife takes pity on Usiskin and lends him her husband's boots for the rest of the journey, which were so big on him that he writes, "It's a shame Charlie Chaplin wasn't there. He would definitely have taken them from me." Once again, Usiskin casts himself in the role of the urban European man who struggles through a steep learning curve in the Canadian prairies. Zolf moves from European cities to Canadian cities, but he too is caught off guard by Canadian realities. Shortly after his arrival, he travels to Niagara Falls to meet a cousin. His cousin, like Usiskin's brother, does not show up at the station, so Zolf decides to find his way on his own. Nothing could have prepared him for what he met upon entering the city. Wie nur hab angeheben gehen übern Gas, seien mir bald entgegengekommen a große Machne maskierte Männer, Frauen und Kinder, alle verschleiert in epische Sache Kostümen, die Mannsspielen in breite, weiberische Spodnitzes, die Frauen in männischer Pluderen, auf die Panimer haben sie getragen, epische Sache groteske Maskes von verschiedenen Couleuren, rote, schwarze, gelbe, grüne, braune. Einige Masken seien gewähnt mit Hörner, mit breite, zerkriemte Meiler, mit große, grobe, verrissenen Näs und mit lange, herausgesteckte rote Zunge. Und jeder einer hat sich gefleißt, herüberzusteigen dem Zweiten in machendem Liarem, was größer mit Geschreien, Fitschereien, Klappen und päglich, Pfeifen und Reven in episse Sache, Grilzen, dicke Trubkes, als Teub zu werden. Es hat ausgesehen, wie die ganze Welt versehen ist. Ruches, Schäding, Leitzim und Volkulaken wollten jetzt herabgekommen her, die abzuspielen von mir als ein kakophonischen Kabelsponin. Ich bin geblieben stehen als Zumuter und nicht gewusst, was zu tun. Ich habe mehr gehabt, als wird mich die Macht nicht Götter, Rachmana Zahlen abhakt haben und mich verschleppen Gott weiß wohin. Ich habe schon Bedeck gehabt, zu nehmen mein Chamoden mit dem Sack und losen sich zurück in Vokzale rein. Aber wieder schlägt man sich zurück zu der Stanzia, als die ganze Gas ist verflitzt mit dem wilden menschlichen Strom, was es nimmt zu in gar kein Sof nicht. Man geht mit tanzendicker Tritt über Trottoiren und über Gassen. Automobilen pfeifen, Truben, Tramwein klingen, signalisieren, aber der zerkrustete Eulen hört sie wie hammendem Gregor. I don't know if any of you guessed what was going on. Zolf finds one person not in costume, another Jew, and asks for help. His new guide reveals that it's a Halloween parade. Zolf has nothing to worry about. He had stumbled into a party, but didn't have the familiarity with local celebrations to realize it. Shechter also includes a funny story about trying to navigate her new home after arrival. In 1905, a Chodesh war mein Ankommen in Winnipeg, hat sich dort geöffnet Eaton's Department Store. Für gewisse Zeit haben sie angeführt a sale auf Regenmanteln zu $1, bloß ein Mantel zu a Customer. Hat mir mein Mann gesagt, als ich dort nicht reden kann, nur noch tun das, was die anderen Frauen tun, und sich euch kaufen ein Mantel. Wenn mein Mann ist in Abend gekommen von der Arbeit und mir gefragt, sie ich habe gekauft ein Regenmantel, habe ich ihm geantwortet, als das ist bloß für Customers. Aber ich bin bei Eaton's noch nicht kein Customer. In this story, Shechter laughs with her readers about her misinterpretation of English, of how her misinterpretation of English tripped her up in what should have been a simple errand. Each of these stories show the author struggling with a different aspect of the new Canadian life: language, culture, landscape, food. They try to use their knowledge from Eastern Europe to interpret and navigate Canadian realities, but the two don't match up. These stories are little glimpses into the stress of incomprehension, of not fitting in and not understanding the society that they jumped into, of being in between two worlds. They joke about it as a way to process the stress. Lachen mit Jesterkes, a bittere Gelachter, laughing through tears. The stories I shared with you today, stories of first impressions, finding work, and funny new encounters, give a glimpse into the experiences and autobiographical storytelling of the wave of Jewish Eastern European immigrants who arrived in Canada between 1880 and 1930. Leaving their homes and moving to Canada, a new place they knew little about, was extremely difficult, both practically and psychologically, especially since they knew there was little chance of them ever returning. These people somehow managed it, and once they arrived, while struggling to adapt to their new environment and circumstances, they also worked to stay connected to Yiddish culture. They did this in many ways, by continuing to speak Yiddish, by establishing Yiddish language institutions in Canada, by participating in broader Yiddish cultural networks through YIVO or dragging 200 publications to Saskatchewan. They also stayed connected by turning their life experiences into stories which they exchanged with their friends, told their children, and eventually wrote down. In doing this, they continued and adapted the storytelling culture of Jewish Eastern Europe into a new culture, a Canadian Eastern European Jewish culture. So thank you very much. And I think now it's time for questions. So, Vivian, if you want to come on and.
Okay, ich bin da. Maybe you could stop your slideshow so that we can all see you.
Sure. Give me 1 second to do that. Hi.
That's better. Okay, very good. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat box and I don't see anything here yet, but I have a question. You know, you mentioned several books and you read from several books that were actually published as books, like Wolofsky and Zolt. But you also mentioned a memoir, for example, Joseph Martin, that you found in the Ontario Jewish Archives.
Yes.
Did you find many other memoirs in the archives that had not been previously published in newspapers or as books? And how did they get there?
So I found, I would say, I don't have the numbers 100% off the top of my head. I would say 1/3 of the material I have is from archives that don't include YIVO. Most of my material is from the YIVO, the competition that YIVO ran, which is also archival stuff. So that got there because YIVO requested it, and people decided to submit. The others, like Martin's, like Pinchas Katz, the authors wrote their memoirs for various reasons. Most of them wrote it down for their children and grandchildren. And their children and grandchildren donated it to the archive. They thought it was important, which it is, and I'm very happy they donated it to the archive. And that's how I found them. So I found personal narratives, autobiographical writings in the OJA, the Ontario Jewish Archive, the Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada, which is the archive in Winnipeg. I've also checked the Ottawa Jewish Archive, which had some interesting writings, but weren't quite full autobiographical writings. So they were people who reflected on their lives and like while giving a Dvar Torah or something like that, a drasha. And in the Montreal Jewish Archives, I found diaries and letters, which I'm also not including in my analysis, but all of these got donated because their children or grandchildren either thought it was important and gave it to the archive or didn't know what to do with it and gave it to the archive, and the archivist decided it was important.
Well, I just wanted to say before we go any further, because now we do have some questions, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everyone. It was really an interesting talk, and I think you really showed that Canadian history can be just as interesting as the histories of other countries. And in fact, it encompasses people from all kinds of different countries and who had very different lives once they got here to Canada. There was a lot of variety in the places that they settled. So thank you for bringing us all these wonderful stories, bringing them to life. And I really wish you success in continuing with this theme, because I think there's a wealth of material for you to work with. Now, there is a question here from Anna Sternschus. Okay, I will unmute, or Sharon, maybe you can unmute Anna. She hasn't put the question, she hasn't put her whole question in the chat box. Oh,
okay, here we go. Thank you. Thanks, Sharon, for unmuting me. Thanks, Vivian, and thanks, Vardit, for the wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you something to follow up on what Vivian said while introducing you, is how you're studying Canadian Jewish history and you're doing your research in Yiddish. So listening to your talk, listening to this very rich stories and biographies and materials, I was just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what we're missing if we are not studying those texts. In other words, like, what are these people putting in their memoirs and in their books in Yiddish that they wouldn't say in English? Or, you know, what would we not know if we couldn't read Yiddish like you do, if we're studying that period? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. That's a great question. I think it's endless what you don't know if you don't speak someone's language. But specifically about migration, I think one of the big things is that these authors, because they were writing in Yiddish, they were writing for an internal audience. They weren't telling the story of the successful immigrant, which, for example, I mentioned already Mary Anton's famous The Promised Land, which was also written in this period by a Eastern European Jew who immigrated to the US. And her story is held up as an example of the successful immigration story. And she actually wrote it trying to convince American society that they should allow Jews and other people to immigrate into America, that they can become Americans. But when you're trying to prove to Anglo-Christians that you can become American, then you have to elide a lot of your Jewish identity. There's a lot of this laughing at themselves. There's a lot of this talking about a lot of the difficulties and what they don't like about Canada that doesn't get in there. That they erase because they know that their readers don't quite understand Jewish culture. So also a little bit of the history. All of them talk about their family in Eastern Europe in detail, sometimes not so pleasant detail. For example, one of the authors writes about how his sister, his aunt, was an aguna. Was an abandoned wife, because what happened is her husband died and she had no children, and so she had to go through the process of levirate marriage. But her brother-in-law, who was supposed to do this process, refused for a long time, which left her in this religious limbo. I don't know if that story would have been included if he wasn't writing in Yiddish, because it doesn't look very good. Not good for the Jews, as they say. But also a lot of the criticism of Canada, the nostalgia of going home, the wishing to be sent back that I mentioned from Martin, that also might have been erased because you want to show how you're grateful to be here and to show the positive side of being Canadian. So I hope that partially at least answers your question. I see that there's a few in the chat box.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Maybe I'll...
do you want to take them yourself? Or
yeah,
okay.
Let's see. So one question from Ita Manfarano, I hope I pronounced your name right, was, were Jews forced to go to rural areas in Canada in order to be able to immigrate to Canada? And were many of them from small shtetls and not from cities? So that's a very good question. I wouldn't say forced. I think forced is overstating the case. Many Jews wanted to move to rural areas. As I mentioned, there was that idea of, oh, this is a place with free land, because the homesteading operation, you got the land for pennies if you were able to build a homestead, build a supporting farm. the Canadian government was essentially giving it away to white Europeans. So a lot of them wanted to move to rural areas, but couldn't, like Shechter's husband, who wasn't able to make it work, like Zolf, who I didn't get to that part of his story, but he, a farmer who was not Jewish, had signed this letter saying that he would support Zolf if Zolf came across and kind of did an apprenticeship on his farm. And it turns out the farmer was Ukrainian and didn't really read English and didn't understand the form he signed. So when Zolf came and was so excited to become a farmer, the guy said, "I'm sorry, buddy, I can barely feed my children. You have to go back to where the Jews are in Winnipeg and find a job," which is what Zolf did. So I think that most of them were actually excited to come across, and most of them didn't become farmers for practical reasons in the end, but they were excited for the opportunity for farming. And then the question about small shtetls versus cities, most of them were not from villages. So there's a Dorf, which is a village, there's a shtetl, which is a market town, and then there's the city, kind of three different places. Obviously, there's things in between. I would say that there weren't very many people from villages. Also, at that time, it was hard for Jews to live in villages in Eastern Europe. And so most of them were from market towns, shtetls, or from cities. I think it's kind of evenly distributed. And a lot of the people who were from shtetls had spent some time in cities before immigrating. You also have to remember that immigrating wasn't easy. It was a very difficult process, and it also cost money. Not only did you need money for the train ticket and to get to the ports, and then the boat ticket, and then the $25 to be allowed in the country, you needed all kinds of other money for food and this and that. So usually it wasn't the poorest people who were coming across. So there's one person who asked about the collections to show the reading group. I have a slide for that. And I think all of this is recorded, but you can also email me and I can send you the slide with the names of all the readings. Let's see. And
there's only one other, which is about the changing one's name. None of the people that you mentioned have actually changed their name, except maybe Joseph Martin.
Yeah, a few of them, I wouldn't really know if they changed their names. They don't necessarily include that information. So there's a few people who could have had changed names, and I just wouldn't know it because they don't write it down. A handful did on purpose, but in these authors, it doesn't seem common. And again, these are people who stayed particularly connected to Yiddish culture. So that might have also been one of the reasons they didn't change their names. They had a very strong Jewish and Yiddish identity.
My question is, I submitted the question, I'm Harley Waxer. It seems that there's a tale where the inspector at the port of entry changed the name. I mean, there's an old joke about the name John Ferguson, which his name, he says, Schoen Ferguson, and the guy said, okay, you're John Ferguson.
Yeah.
But, it seems to me that the papers would have had to have been made out in the country that they're leaving from. So by the time they arrived in Quebec City or Halifax or New York, the last name was already there, that the inspector didn't have to give them a new name, nor did they choose to allow it to happen.
Yeah, I think that I don't 100% know the process. Again, I don't have stories about changing names. They definitely dealt with inspectors once landing in Canada. And again, things weren't as organized or as automatic as they are now. So it could be that they did the process twice. It could be that the papers that were filled out in Europe, because they did fill out papers in Europe, had to be filled out again in Canada and weren't really intelligible to the inspectors in Canada. But also a lot of people wanted to change their name. My last name, for example, Lightstone, isn't a classic Jewish name. You might have noticed. And my great-great-grandfather changed his last name 2 or 3 times once he had already moved to North America for various reasons.
Primarily
He just
to hide
wanted
their
to change his name.
Primarily to hide their identity as Jews.
No, I think he changed his name because there's also the family story anyways, is that you change your name, you change your luck. And he had pretty bad luck in business. But we've so you never know. There are people who changed their names and stopped associating with the Jewish community. And those are people whose stories we generally don't have because they stopped associating with the Jewish community.
Right.
So they didn't write down their stories.
Thank you.
If I may just interject here, somebody did give an answer, which is really probably true of many people, that these forms were filled out in their native countries, like in the Russian Empire and Poland, for example. Polish spellings are very difficult to pronounce in English. And that's what happened. The customs people just couldn't pronounce them. And so they were simplified.
Yeah.
And the same with Cyrillic, things written in Cyrillic, they couldn't read them. So that's the simple answer. And now I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. If there are no other questions, I think we'll end here. And just to say, this was really delightful. It was really enjoyable to hear these stories. One of the things that I would add that Yiddish adds to these memoirs is the humor. I think it would have been hard to express that kind of humor in another language.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that Jews responded to adversity with humor, and you pointed that out.
Yeah.
Something
else I just want to add on that topic is there's also the wordplay. You might have noticed that talking about a Mackinac using the word homesteads, Shechter using the word sewers. She also in brackets includes the word in the more classic Yiddish word. But that wordplay and how English comes into the language and influences their language is also something you get only by reading in Yiddish.
Yeah.
I just want to say regarding the change of name. Can you hear me still? No, I think we're cut.
No, you're off now.
Yeah, it's too bad. I remember my father changing his name when I was a little girl and the process that they went through and the people that helped. And it was because of business reasons. They couldn't use, the name was too long. At that time, they thought that. I don't know whether today he would have changed it, but I remember sitting on the veranda with a number of people, a number of adults helping him pick a name. We retained. Thank you very much, Vardit. I'm Ruth Hyman, and we had the Hyman's bookstore.
Oh,
Just
nice.
for a moment, I have a few stories. One is family whose name was Shakovitz, and they couldn't pronounce it. They couldn't deal with that at the Canadian border. So they asked him, "What are you?" And the guy said, "I'm a Cohen." So his name is Cohen now.
Good.
And my
Very
father's family bought passports to get out of Russia from somebody whose name was Goldenblatt, and their name was totally different. Well, that happened in Europe, but I've heard of names here where as you mentioned, they couldn't pronounce the names, the Polish, the Russian, all these names, and so they changed the name. Sometimes it was something totally different, like these Shakovitz that became Cohen.
Sean Ferguson.
Yeah, it's an old joke. It's good.
Very old, but might be some truth to it.
Our name was my maiden name was Warshawski, and it was changed to Warner. A lot of Warshawskis were changed to Warsh.
Or the translation, Weiss to white, Schwartz to Sam Black. By the way, I still have my bar mitzvah book that I bought from, I guess, your grandfather.
Right.
When you were on Spadina.
Right.
Yeah, I still have it.
With the name Hyman's Bookstore.
Yeah, it's stamped.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Someone came knocking at our door about 3 years ago, asking if we could give them a book with a stamp of Hyman's Bookstore in it. We did.
Was he your grandfather?
It was my husband Gurian's father who opened, Ben Sion Hyman, who opened the first store about 1925 at 412 Spadina Avenue.
Okay.
I know the tours of Spadina, they mention the Hyman's bookstore actually.
Didn't Lieberman buy it after that?
Oh, much after.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. And
Great.
thanks for coming. And it was a wonderful talk. Thank you, Vardit.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.